After years of serving as conduit to Donald Trump's steady stream of misinformation, Big Tech has decided to silence the outgoing commander-in-chief. Better late than never, say his critics.
President Trump is a failed leader. He will go down in history as the worst president ever. The good thing is that he soon will be as irrelevant as an old tweet.
Twitter permanently terminated Trump's account last week after what the company says were repeated violations of its rules against inciting violence. He's also been indefinitely suspended from Facebook and Instagram. Many had expected the president to move to Parler, a Twitter copycat that found a niche market with conservatives. But that option's been taken off the table. Parler has gone offline after Amazon kicked the network off its servers.
Recently, we've seen a steady increase in this violent content on your website, all of which violates our terms. It's clear that Parler does not have an effective process to comply with the Amazon Web Services terms of service.
Apple and Google had already removed Parler from their app stores for the same reason. The company says it's the target of a coordinated attack on free speech in the US. But experts say private companies are free to determine how their services are used.
The First Amendment begins with the words, "Congress shall make no law." The First Amendment covers the actions of the government of the United States. And Donald Trump has, repeatedly violated their terms of use, their terms of service, the rules.
Not everyone agrees. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has called the social media ban on Trump problematic. The American Civil Liberties Union is no fan of Trump's. But the group says if Big Tech can deplatform a sitting US president, then nothing's stopping companies from silencing anyone else. Paolo Montesillo, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on the Parler ban now with Jonathan Broughton in London. He's a tech industry expert and the managing director at Workshare Consulting. Welcome back to the program, Jonathan. Now, let's start with Parler because Amazon, Google and Apple have all cut ties with the app, as we know, forcing it to close because they say the platform allows for the violent content to basically be disseminated amongst its users. Do these tech companies have a responsibility to act and intervene in this way?
Yeah, there's two ways to consider that. The first would be under US law, Section 230 gives them certain protections against the content that is published on their platforms. And certainly, if you're looking at sort of mobile phone sort of app stores, that's a platform of sorts, and it's certainly true also for things like AWS. So there is a legal precedent which does say, in return for these protections, that we do need to enforce certain standards when considering the type of content that's available on their platform. Secondarily to this, we've also seen, certainly in the last year, 18 months, advertisers to become increasingly concerned around the kind of content that's available on social media, on these kinds of platforms, and then the effect that has on their brands that they're promoting. So not only is there a legal precedent, certainly in the States, in terms of the way they make their money via advertising, they also need to be very careful about damaging the brands of other companies that they also do business with.
Okay, let's talk more about the Communications Decency Act in the US, which you mentioned there, because we know conservatives in America have long railed against Section 230, which effectively shields these tech companies from the liability from the posts that their users disseminate on their platforms. But here we have these same tech companies essentially acting and taking responsibility for the posts that the users are posting on their platform. So what is it that these conservatives and these critics want exactly, if even when these companies are taking responsibility, are taking action, they're still unhappy?
It's a good question. Certainly, there's been dissatisfaction from the tech companies themselves in how they're sort of facing sort of criticism from both sides when any sort of action is taken. If they don't take enough action, that they're criticised by sort of the left liberals. And if they take too much action, And there's certainly a lot of voices, especially right, which rail against implications of this on free speech. I have a lot of sympathy for the leaders of tech companies who have repeatedly asked for clearer guidance or perhaps even enhanced regulation, as it's not a good look, certainly, for any tech companies to be involved with free speech. The flip side of that, of course, is that for, of course, politicians, it's also a bit of a poison chalice in trying to balance these two measures. I suspect there's not going to be an answer to this anytime soon. One thing that's notable is that in response to Parler being dropped by various platforms, including its server provider, it is highlighted that it itself does in fact enjoy protections under Section 230, and of course does implement certain types of moderation on its free speech platform itself. So I think one takeaway from this is that if Parler does survive, it will certainly become a platform with regulation more like those seen on other social media platforms.
It's interesting because these criticisms of the tech bans are also being shared by world leaders who've been critical of Donald Trump in the past. We've got German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who says lawmakers should set the rules governing free speech, not tech companies, while the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire also says the state should be responsible rather than, quote, the digital oligarchy. Do they have a point here, or is it just the fact that these tech companies are acting in a timely manner before they wait for these laws to be passed?
I think they absolutely have a point there. And to be clear, it's a point that some of the tech companies themselves have raised, saying, they're uncomfortable with being the guardians of free speech. So I think that's a fair point to make. I think it's clear, and I think you're right saying they're acting now before impending legislation is eventually passed. I think the reason they're doing it is for effectively brand protection.
Okay, Jonathan Broughton, thank you so much again for joining us on this program.